learned that I would be working on a camera trap project focused on Fusa, the first thing I thought was, aren't they made up for that movie? The movie I'm talking about is Madagascar. It's an animated movie by DreamWorks, and if you've seen it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's got King Julian, which is the ringtail lemur. It's got those 3 penguins that go on all sorts of crazy adventures. And then, of course, there is the Fusa. The Fusa that is the enemy of all the lemurs and is the main villain that needs to be defeated in the movie. So, I grew up thinking that there was no such thing as a Fusa. And when I heard about Fusa, and I heard that I could actually camera trap Fusa and take pictures of them and study them, I was amazed. I had spent all of my undergraduate degree from 2008 to 2012 just terrified that I would be working on things like white-tailed deer and bobwhite quail, game animals, things that weren't exotic or cool. I wanted to go to places that I had seen on National Geographic documentaries. I wanted to go to Africa and go to the Serengeti and study lions. I wanted to go to Yellowstone and study wolves. I wanted to go, it turns out, to Madagascar and study Fusa. Here was my shot to actually discover the things I had only seen in documentaries and only read about in magazines. And here was my shot to actually discover things the way that the 18th and 19th century explorers had discovered things. And it turns out that when I did get to Madagascar, I did discover things. I found things that were completely new to me, things that I wouldn't have dreamed I would have seen. Things like iridescent pythons that snuck into camp looking for mice or rats to eat. Things like white lemurs that came into camp and went like the rainforest mist. Things like Indri. You're unable to be seen, but you can hear them 6 in the morning singing like whales. It was insane, and it was great in some aspects. So Madagascar, while it was exotic and it was strange and completely new to me, it was also strangely normal. It was cold and rainy, and I got sick with a cold, not like an interesting disease that I picked up from the rainforest. People had cell phones and electricity. I could work on data entry and analysis while I was actually in town because I had electricity. I could plug in my laptop. I didn't think I was going to be able to do that. And there were white people everywhere, just like they typically were in the towns that I lived in, just drunk on the privilege of the first world, who didn't see Malagasy people as people, kind of the same way that a lot of white people don't see my people as people in America. And worse than all that, the wildlife that I grew to love turned out to be in trouble. People were cutting down the forest, people were hunting them with snares and guns and dogs, and I came home concerned about a place that was nearly a day's plane ride away. I wanted to know why the Malagasy didn't understand how special their home was, how special the silky shafaka were, and the Indri that sang like whales. I wanted to know why they didn't want to protect what was left of their heritage. And I wanted to know, how did it get so bad? How was it that Madagascar had ended up with just 10% of its rainforest left? How was it that there were only 300 silky shafaka in the entire world? I didn't understand. So a few years goes by, and I meet Cynthia Malone, who was another Black scientist going through her graduate degree. And she gave me a clue when she talked about environmental justice and decolonization at a conference I went to in New York. I had never heard the word decolonization before. I had never heard the word environmental justice before either. And those two words sent me on another kind of journey, less fantastical, but no less mind-expanding, one that went back in time. I had taken history classes all my life, and I had learned about wildlife management and conservation throughout my entire undergraduate. 4 years of classes. I had learned about Gifford Pinchot and the U.S. Forest Service. I had learned about John Muir and the Sierra Club. I had also read the Sound County Almanac, and people constantly quoted Aldo Leopold to me. I thought I knew almost everything I needed to know about wildlife conservation and wildlife management. But I had never learned that the Nez Perce and the Shoshone and the Crow people from the region that would be called Yellowstone National Park, our first national park, turned out that they were ran off this region by the U.S. Army. Their land had been stolen. They had been forced out of their homes. I never learned that Belgium got rich off of slaughtering elephants for ivory and chopping down native forests for timber and killing millions of Congolese during the King Leopold's free rubber state and afterwards during the colonization years. I never learned that in less than 35 years, less than the time that I have been alive, France actually destroyed 70% of Madagascar's forests while displacing the native Malagasy, kicking them off their lands, their ancestral lands, and becoming rich off of loads of rosewood and ebony and sugarcane and vanilla. More importantly, I never learned that Malagasy never had a real choice in what was protected and what was off limits to them, because someone had drawn a boundary on a map and said that this area should be preserved for nature. I never knew that the colonial French government had drawn these reserve boundaries the way that Europe had drawn Africa into countries in 1885 in Berlin. I'm not sure if you've read Ministry of the Future or not. It's a science fiction book. If you have read it already, good on you. You might remember some chapters focused on half-Earth projects. I was glad that Robinson actually focused on North America when he was showing these half-Earth projects, the idea of carving the Earth into one half and leaving one half for nature, one half for humans. Robinson could have gone the easy way out and shown this happening in Africa, which is what the project actually wants to happen. But he decided to focus on North America. And even though he didn't mention the indigenous people that had once lived in the Sierras or the Rockies or the Great Plains, he did mention local Americans and how they were emotionally and financially and physically influenced by this idea of half of the earth being reserved for nature. And the actual Half-Earth project does purport to be focused on global conservation and focused on indigenous rights as well. But if you look at the actual project video, the one that they put on YouTube to advertise the project, what do you see? I'll tell you what I saw. I saw pictures of African wildlife and Africa being carved up again by old men, this time just one, an old man from Alabama. Out of roughly the 120 seconds that the video takes up, about 95 of them are focused on Africa. And out of the 14 individuals on the Half-Earth Team Council, only one is indigenous. The reason I mention media and the reason I mention the YouTube video that Half-Earth uses to advertise this project is because what we see and hear and read about is important. The things that I saw and heard and read about influenced me to become a scientist and to actually go to places like Madagascar. So what you read and hear and see will influence your thoughts on the world too. Now I'm going to ask you a question. What do you think of when you think of conservation? Do you think of protecting North America's native bees from climate change? Or do you think of tigers in Sumatra and lions in Namibia, more than a day's plane ride away? Did you know that Africa already has 28% of its landmass designated as a protected area? And this is even though the people and the environment are still recovering from the damages that colonialism did on the continent. Colonialism only ended about 50 years ago. My grandma is older than 50 years. My dad is older than 50 years. And even though the richest country on the continent only has a GDP that's 46 times smaller than the United States, Africans are still protecting all of this land. This is compared to the United States. The United States has only protected 12% of its land. I broke down the numbers. If we were even going to get up to 28%, like Africa currently has, we would have to take Texas, California, Minnesota, and Olympic National Park in Washington. Where would those people go? These are the struggles and the conflicts that people in Africa are having to face today because they protect so much land. And yet, I bet you thought about tigers or pandas or lemurs or lions when you thought of conservation and what needs to be preserved, didn't you? So how is it fair to actually focus conservation on the global south, on Africa, on Southeast Asia, on South Asia, on Latin America, when the global north, which is the ultimate cause of deforestation and climate change, hasn't done it yet? In my opinion, I don't think it's fair that we in the global north, who consume so much and we're the cause of so much deforestation and greenhouse gas emissions, should force the global south to pay for our sins. And I think if we want the global south to protect 50% of their land area, we should be the first ones to do that. But we still have to conserve things. I'm not against that. I understand that that's a need, but how to do it in a way that's just and is respecting and acknowledging and giving power back to indigenous peoples. White scientists, white conservationists carving up the world isn't the way to go. It's just perpetuating more injustice. We should focus on homegrown conservation movements, giving land and power back to the locals. For example, in Madagascar, there's Alliance Malagasy and Antangil Conservation, Impact Madagascar, Mahaliana. These are organizations that either work in local conservation or protecting local land rights, and even teaching new Malagasy students to become scientists and veterinarians themselves. Here in the United States, there's the NDN Collective and the Métis in Space Land Trust. These are indigenous-led conservation organizations and movements. They're out there. They may not have the slick visuals or the cool web pages or the highly acknowledged and praised council members that the Half Earth Project might have. But they're out there and they have wisdom, and more importantly, they have the right to lead us. And they need our money and support. And finally, I would suggest go outside, smell the native grasses, watch the native birds, listen to the yip song of a coyote pack, and realize that there are people who would be just as astounded to see a cardinal as you would be to see a tiger. We have our own wonders right here in the United States, and they're just as in need of conserving as anything else in the world. When we think about conservation, let's try to keep it close to home.